Are we all set, John?
You should be.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So good afternoon. I call to order the Policy Committee meeting of Monday, September 19th at 11:02. So welcome, everyone. I am so excited for us to begin the work of this committee this school year. As a part of that work, and just to set the stage, I believe it's important to communicate how our policies appear on our agenda, as well as the approval process. So we do receive legislative updates from CABE, which is the Connecticut Association of Boards of Ed, and Shipman and Goodwin, who is our legal counsel. These could be recommended or required policies. We also had an audit on our policies in 2019 by CABE. This year, you will hear me use the word audit often. Over the summer, I did spend some time just going through the audit, and one of the things that it broke down for us is which policies need modification. So example, modified to reflect current language, replaced with the latest version, not reflective of current legislation. So in an effort to help organize our work, I have pulled those as a recommendation to review. We also could review current policies through shared feedback with administration, staff, students, and the Ridgefield community. Then our recommendations on these policies as a committee move forward to the full Board of Education for 2 reads. So the first read is for recommendations and questions, and then a second read for a possible approval. Our work is definitely a value part of this Board of Education. And with that, let us just jump right into our first policy for discussion, policy 5123, promotion.
Thank you, Rachel. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, last time this policy was revised was 2011. It is a required policy by CABE. And Dr. Silva, would you like to take us through this policy?
Yes, thank you. And a big thanks to Rachel, because what I didn't really realize, probably because I was so new and had so much to learn, how much work Margaret initially, when I was on the when I came on as superintendent, and she was the chair of the policy committee, and now Rachel, how much has to be done in the background to prepare us for these meetings. A lot of studying, a lot of research, and a lot of working with the administration back and forth, which, if you can imagine, can be incredibly frustrating, I imagine, from Rachel or Margaret's part, because we're on our schedule, they're on theirs, and it's just a lot of back and forth by way of email. So a big thank you to Rachel for being so patient and doing the heavy lift. The other piece that I've come to realize, and I'll speak to it a little bit with promotion, is that we're lucky to have, as Rachel described, the audit that was done, and then having somebody in the position as chair that's willing to do the lift, because some of these policies are incredibly old. They still apply, but they're in some ways, but they're a bit dated. So that's a little bit the case with this particular policy, which is around promotion. And so you'll see that our original policy was in 2011. And so in preparation to revise this policy, and I'll let you know why we wanted to revise it in a minute, is that I searched through Shipman's policy, I searched through CABE. We looked at a lot of different school districts, some that are similar to us, some that are different, just to understand what their policies look like. What we realized with our promotion policy is that in some ways it didn't reflect what the current research really suggests about promotion and or retention. And our policy actually was limited to, in some ways, just promotion. That's what it said, not the retention piece. So we felt that was important to bring to light. But the research is pretty clear on retention, and it really should be an extraordinary measure, but that wasn't reflected as well as it needed to be in our current policy. Further, I think helping, and I think part of the reason some of these policies, in fact, even Shipman, are written the way that they're written is to support those school districts that are required, or at least at one point were required, to retain students based on their reading level. Because they were Title I school districts or Alliance school districts, whatever those reasons were. So a lot of these policies really reflected being able to support those communities, which obviously need that, but in our particular case, it's a bit different. So what we really wanted to do was look at what's reflective of the research and what we know, and ensure that our policy reflected best practice. So first and foremost, you'll notice that right out of the gate, we kept that first sentence, but we changed the language from "it is expected that most students in the Ridgefield Public Schools will progress from grade to grade each year based upon academic achievement." So we changed that language right away and we removed that "most." It is expected that our students come to school and they move from one grade level to the next. We also wanted to acknowledge that within any grade level, that there is a range of student performance, right? Not every kid is a 4 or an A, and that doesn't mean that retention is necessary for them, or that they're not going to be really successful in the next year, and or that they may not need support to be successful. But the reality is that there is a range within every grade level. So we wanted to be sure that that was identified in the new policy. We also, like I said, want to highlight that there are times in which students may require support within their grade level. Might mean for a moment in time, it might mean a little bit longer, it might mean that they need an IEP. But again, that doesn't mean that they should not progress from one grade level to the next. So we wanted to be sure that that was there. As I mentioned, the looking at retention based on what research says and identifying it as an extraordinary measure, not one that we take lightly. Not a reason to keep a child back. A reason might not be because we want them to be smarter, stronger, more mature. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes another year doesn't make a child more mature at all. And in fact, we really want to be clear that a year of the same doesn't necessarily benefit a student. So if you think about, let's just say a second grade student, right, or even a kindergarten student, and you think about what a whole year looks like for them from September to June, and now think about that child being retained and having to start right back in September, right? So for a kindergarten student, just understanding school and what school is and what it's intended to be, and understanding what our playground looks like and the rules in our classroom, that's where that child would begin again. And that's really the whole trajectory. Again, different for secondary level when you're looking at high school graduation and all of that, but this is really geared towards your students in a more traditional, not looking at graduation requirements setting. That it's also our job to progress monitor students and communicate with parents in a systematic and continuous way. So we wanted to just make sure that that language was super clear in the new policy. And we have that obviously with our progress reports. If a student enters into MTSS or for special education, there are processes and structures that are currently in place. And that retention is not used as an intervention in lieu of the supplemental supports that we have available for students in general education and or in special education. That we do have to make that decision, that it's done in collaboration with the principal, support staff, classroom teachers, guidance counselors, and or other support personnel, including school psychologists, if it's necessary. Lastly, there are occasions when we do receive requests from families to have children skip grades. Similarly to retention, there's plenty of research around that topic. And as you can imagine, skipping a grade, what that actually means is that you've skipped a grade, not only content, and that's across every content area, but it's also the social, emotional maturity that happens within a year. And that a lot happens within a year. And I think everybody on this line is a parent. So we've seen that happen in our home. And for those of us that are teachers, we've seen it happen in our classrooms in our school. There's a lot of maturity and academic growth that happens across the year. While there are very rare cases where that might be appropriate, the assistant superintendent in the schools or their designee might permit that acceleration. Again, it should be rare or unusual. So that's why we have a change in this policy. We really wanted to reflect research. We wanted to reflect what's accurately happening in our school. So it's not necessarily a legislative or an audit piece. but just a real presentation of the work that's happening in schools. And many school districts, I think, again, maybe because they don't have the Rachels or the Margarets sitting and doing the heavy lifting, their policies don't really reflect, I think, what best practice is. So I'll take questions if you want, Rachel, on that policy.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Silva. Any questions? Divya?
So I like what has been, listed out by Dr. De Silva. My point was it is very clear for retention. The process is very clear, as in every single stakeholder is getting involved. Would that be the case for skipping grades as well, or is it only the assistant superintendent and the school principal getting involved?
So you're right. We would not, if we received a request, and we have, we've received requests, it's typically the same individuals. I wouldn't necessarily say the psychologist or a counselor, but they do have a role and an important one. So that's interesting feedback. And maybe we can look at adding that same language down below. If the group feels that would be appropriate, because I do think in particular, your school psychologists or your counselors have a lot to communicate around, this particular topic and what that would mean on the emotional maturity side for kids. So we can add that language if the committee feels like that makes sense to do.
Yeah. Selena?
Like I said, it's far more rare. It's rare a case that we have a student that across every academic area is at a place where one would say that they could skip every part of that content and move on to another grade level. But I think it's worth documenting the stakeholders that are involved, because they are.
Just to have clarity in the process.
I think that's a great point, Divya. I really do, because I also think that helps protect the principal and the assistant principal and the superintendent, because sometimes you can feel pressure, outside pressure. And I think the emotional health of a child is really, really important. And sometimes academically they might be ready, but their maturity level might not quite, be there. And if you have, especially if somebody enters kindergarten and they're 4 and say they're in the 7th grade and, they're still really young, they might be brilliant, but emotionally they're just not ready. So I think that would be great if we could add some language. And I know Rachel's great at adding the language, so I'm not even going to pretend that I can add that. I'll just let Rachel figure it out and our legal team. And then you all can come back to the committee and we'll be here for you.
Thank you, Selena. Thank you, Divya.
No pressure, Rachel.
No pressure. But we also have Dr. De Silva and Dr. Hanaway and Miss Dewing, Miss Brown. So we got a great team.
So I think the reason we didn't place it here, but we can, is because it is essentially what we do when we receive a request, right, from any parent, really regarding anything. We come together, teacher, counselor, psychologist. What do we notice? It is very rare, though, that a student in this particular circumstance that that research is super clear also, that skipping a grade would ever really be a viable option, except very, very rare. So that's why it's not included here, but I don't think that there's any harm, and it just adds a parallel to the retention piece.
So Dr. De Silva, we could add, as you're saying, just a line there about just additional stakeholders. And then I think we could move that forward then to the full board for a first read. Would the committee be in? Okay, great. Thank you so much. And anything else on this policy before moving forward? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So moving along, our next policy is policy 6111, school calendar. So the last time this policy was revised was June of 2021. As per the CAPE July 2022 update, the legal references to this policy have changed, but not the language in the policy itself. So the legal references that have been updated are to reflect Public Act 22-47, an act concerning children's mental health, and Public Act 22-128, an act establishing Juneteenth Independence Day as a legal holiday. So Public Act 22-47, an act concerning children's mental health, requires the governor to proclaim May 26th of each year to be Get Outside and Play for Children's Mental Health Day. It's to raise awareness about children's mental health and wellness. Public Act 22-128 is an act establishing Juneteenth Independence Day as a legal holiday. So this act will establish a new legal state holiday on June 19th, known as Juneteenth Independence Day. The decision to close public schools on Juneteenth Independence Day is made by each local school district. By law, each local and regional board of education that remains open on a legal state holiday must hold a suitable education program in observance of that holiday. So if you take a look in front of you, again, there's been no correction to the language in the policy, but an update to the legal references. Are there any questions on this policy or legal references? No? Would the administration team like to add anything on this policy before?
So Rachel, I will. So as you said, the school districts are expected, if students are in school, that there be some type of program for children on that day. So when we bring this policy to the board, we will talk very briefly about what our plan will be, because the challenge is, what we don't want to do is talk about this holiday only because, or this legal holiday only because we have to, because we happen to be in school on that day. And first of all, it's not planning wise, that doesn't make sense, but secondarily, that's not the point. And so what our plan will, because as of, let's just look at this calendar year, for example. So right now, our students are out of school on June 16th, tentatively, sorry, June 15th, which we know is unlikely to happen. So that means the 16th is actually a professional learning date for staff, but that would be moved. So students would likely be in school on the 19th, right? So this year it would work out and we would have a plan and fine. But in other years, it may not actually be. So let's just say that our students were out on the 13th, then ultimately they wouldn't have an opportunity to learn about this legal holiday at all because they weren't in school on that day. So what we'd like to do, and we're not prepared to share out a full plan, but what we'd like to do is talk about how we will bring in some opportunity for kids. Some of it may be very directly connected because it happens to be that we're in school, or perhaps indirectly connected because we're not in school, but we want kids to understand why June 19th is here and why it's a legal holiday. So we'll talk through that very overview-ish because we're not quite prepared to get into the details on the 27th of September when this policy moves forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And that's actually right with what the policy says too. If everyone looks at paragraph 2, it says the calendars recommended to the board may include the operation of the schools on state holidays. So I think we're doing exactly what also, not only what we want to do as Ridgefield Public Schools, but what we need to do. So thank you so much. Any other questions on this policy? Okay, so this will move forward then to the full board for a first read. Thank you. Okay, so next up, so in front of you, you have policy 6171, which was last revised in June of 1994. Then you have policy 6171.1, which was also last revised in June of 1995. So a recommendation as per the audit of 2019 is to replace these dated versions 6171 and 6171.1 with a new single policy. That new single policy is also attached in front of you. It says suggested K policy 6171, special education. If you take a look at the first paragraph, it really clearly defines the purpose of what this policy should be. The district shall provide a free and appropriate public education and necessary related services to all children with disabilities residing within the district, required under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the American with Disabilities Act. I know we are looking at 2 and combining to 1 as the suggested version. Would administration like to jump in and add at this point before asking questions?
Sure, I can.
Thank you.
So I think it's Susie had mentioned, and I don't exactly remember the exact language she used, but the suggested revisions connected to the CABE policy both capture more of an update into what our practice is and show a closer adherence to the language from the federal law. So the new CABE policy, one of the biggest changes you'll note from at least the 6171 exceptional children policy is we don't get into a description of, what qualifies a student as being exceptional. Because it's not necessary as part of the policy that's captured within the federal law and state regulations. And frankly, the previous 1994 policy isn't inclusive enough. It's too limiting in descriptions, and the description is taken out and not necessary. And then in the previous policy 6171.1 also was not any more closely adherent to the updates to the IDEA that have taken place since 1995, which there's been a good amount of updates to the law. And so what you'll notice in the proposed CABE policy is a lot of reference to adhering to the law. Because instead of us continuing to revise the policy to quote what the updated version of the law is, and I'll just give you a quick example, 6171.1 references students who are eligible for transition planning as those being of 15 years of age. It's actually 14 now. As we know, students are eligible now in the state of Connecticut until the age of 22, if the PPT determines it, rather than 21. So the suggested CABE policy with our recommendations ensures that the district always remains in compliance, both with the law and with its own policies, because the policy quotes adherence to the federal law. Probably the most succinct way I could put it. Questions?
Any questions? I think that was beautifully put.
I have one question.
Selena?
Would we be able to, and I don't know if we can change this one word or not because of the law, but are we able to change disabled to differently abled?
I think connected to the IDEA, no. Other areas where we're describing the work that we do, I think using, there's a big movement to using language that describes less so the person rather than the situation, right? So differently abled, Susie says a lot, people with learning differences, they're not special education students, they're students who receive IEP services. So any efforts we can make, and maybe, I'm happy to reread this one and the subsequent preschool policy if there are opportunities where not connected to the actual law that we could use more inclusive language rather than saying disabled. Mm-hmm. We do talk about kids with exceptionalities a lot, which means a lot of things. So connected to IDEA, no, but I can, and I'm happy to do what the subcommittee likes. I can reread it again to see if there's other chances to diversify the language.
I mean, I understand when it's connected to the law. That's why I asked. So it just like disabled sounds negative, and differently abled is, well, we are all differently abled. My writing stinks, my handwriting,
Right. No, I think the spirit behind that is a good one.
Yeah. Thank you for looking at that. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Great question, Selena. Thank you so much, Dr. Hanaway, for taking another read at this. And then I think after that, we could definitely bring them to the full board. So policy 6171, that would go to the full board for a first read. And then we would also have to bring policy 6171.1 to be rescinded, to take back.
And 617, I'm sorry. So 6171 is a revision.
Right.
The other one is rescinded, right? Okay.
Okay. So the next policy up for discussion is 6171.2. This is preschool special education. So as per the CABE audit of 2019, this is a mandated policy which is lacking. But this may be a new policy, but it's not a new program to Ridgefield. So we want to make that very clear. Dr. Hanaway, would you like to go through this as well? Thank you.
So this preschool policy falls under special education because our preschool program is a special education program that invites non-disabled students to participate in, or as we call them, peers generally. So that may be a first question is, why does our preschool policy fall under special education? Because technically our preschool program is a special education program. If it weren't for to implement special education services, we don't have universal preschool in Ridgefield. So this policy outlines the process we go through and the rights that families have to refer children who are either through the birth to 3 system, which is the state early intervention system, or through just, from their homes or from the community or elsewhere to refer for services if they suspect that they may have special needs. It also describes the nature of our program, which is a reverse mainstreaming model, which means that students who do not receive IEP services are invited to participate with students who receive IEP services. And then it very clearly outlines our child find process, which is the efforts we take to identify and evaluate and then service students who may be eligible for services. And then lastly, it speaks to information that we provide parents when students are not eligible. There was new legislation that went into effect this past year that students who are not eligible were required to support families with continuing a screening process for 3 months after we say they're not eligible, just to gather information from families on how they're doing. So if there is a need to re-refer them, we stay in communication with those families. And then the last piece of the policy speaks to the tuition that the district can collect on behalf of the town for students who do not receive IEP services in order to participate.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions on this policy? Okay, great. So this could also go to the full board for a first read. Thank you so much, Dr. Hanaway. Next policy up is 6172, alternative education programs. Again, as per the CABE audit of 2019, this is a mandated policy that was lacking. But again, this is a new policy, but not a new program to Ridgefield.
Right.
Dr. Hanaway, would you like to?
Yep. This is my day.
This is all you.
So we have an alternative high school program in district. We have for multiple years. Divya, I'd be happy to send you. We had our then alternative high school coordinator, Angela King, come to the Board of Ed and present last year. And I could always send you that presentation. It was useful to kind of understand the nature of the program, the goals of the program, and the direction it's taking. With that said, this policy speaks to the district's efforts in order to meet all students' needs, not necessarily students with disabilities, but all students' needs to provide an alternate program if they need such for social, emotional, behavioral, or academic purposes. In most alternative high school programs you'll find locally, that means not physically taking place at the high school. Most of them include taking place in an alternative setting than the high school, and also offer some creative programming models that may not be immediately available at the high school. Most of them are also much smaller than any of the programs that we would provide at Ridgefield High School. Right now, our alternative program is limited to high school students. And this policy speaks to how the district will go about designing the program, as well as supporting students in a referral and assessment process to see if they are eligible. Districts do have the option to join forces, so to speak, and design a collaborative alternative high school program. We have not found opportunities to do that, although we have visited other districts to see what their programs look like. There's a lot of logistics involved that, you know, is kind of a risk reward analysis for us. So that so just to mention, that is captured in the policy if that's something we wanted to do, but not something that we currently do right now. And that we'll have public information available about our program. Let's see if there's anything else. And what's not spoken to here in detail, but that there is a process of students also who, after being referred and attending the alternative high school, who do transition back to Ridgefield High School, and that is a regular part of the process if appropriate.
Are there any questions? Divya?
So is there any specific eligibility criteria put forth in this policy?
No.
Something which is just made from the parent side as the request?
No, there are internal procedures, operational procedures. We do have a process for referral. They're not in the policy because, frankly, similar to the special education process, at times they have been revised even in the last 4 years in terms of what specifically that process looks like. Any family who'd be interested in knowing what our process is, and there is criteria. It's mostly subjective. There is some, not subjective, but rather qualitative. There is quantitative analysis of student attendance, student performance, and things like that. But much of the process includes understanding the interventions that have already taken place for an individual student. So we only consider the alternative high school after having attempted interventions and seeing what kind of success they brought and why the alternative high school might serve as an appropriate fit when those interventions haven't yet. So we don't have that criteria written into the policy, but any family who'd be interested, you know, we would absolutely share it with them. But so to your latter point, Divya, parents can request a referral and they would meet with the school and Richfield High School, and then together they would determine, you know, whether or not it would be an appropriate time or fit to make a referral.
Liz, you may have mentioned this, but I just wanted to be sure that everyone understood that alternative high school, we do, just because Liz is the one speaking, is that we do have children there that do have IEPs, but we also have general education students. And sometimes students transitioning from a particular placement, it could even be a hospitalization into the larger school setting, may not be appropriate. So it may be just even a middle step for some students. Divya, you'll hear across our conversations across the year, the challenge that we've had with the spacing at the alternative high school, given what I've just described, but that's not for today.
The background for my question was, do the parents from the general, you know, not the children with IEPs, have the visibility that this option is available for them? That is why I wanted to know if the criteria was, you know, listed out and people have the knowledge that they use the option.
So our school counselors play a really critical role in the referral process. So the school counselors play as a conduit if families aren't already aware of it. If they ask of it, the school counselors give them information. And if they're not, there are times where we bring it up to families. So the school counselors do play a very important role that the parents aren't already aware, to provide them with information about it. I'd have to look in terms of where it might be located on the Ridgefield High School website. I'd have to look carefully myself to ensure that it is where I think it is, just to make sure for your question around visibility to the general public that it's equally accessible.
Thank you.
Good questions. Any other questions? Okay, so we can move this forward, I believe, for a first read with the full board. And our last policy on the agenda for today is homebound and hospital instruction. So this policy was last revised in June of 1995. The recommendation as per the CABE audit of 2019 is to consider a newer CABE version, which is compliant with regulatory changes. If you look at our current version, I think you could see why it needs to be updated very visually. But the purpose is home and hospital instruction shall be a teaching service available as mandated by section 10-76D 15 of the Connecticut State Board of Education regulations to students who are unable to attend school for medical and or mental health reasons for a period of 2 weeks or longer. I really have to give credit to Dr. Hanaway and Dr. De Silva, who really were behind the scenes working on these for us. The collaboration is really enormous. So thank you so much. And Dr. Hanaway, would you like
Sure. So homebound and hospitalized instruction is a service for any student who is eligible. So that also, just by way of FYI, also runs through my office. So this CABE suggested policy speaks directly to the Connecticut state regulations, in some cases close to word for word, which is far more complete and thorough as compared with the previous policy. So students who are unable to attend school, as Rachel said, for medical or mental health reasons for 2 weeks or longer, we initiate homebound or hospitalized instruction, or students who have a medical condition that will require periodic expected absences throughout the school year. A student who's receiving medical treatment for some kind of need, and we know every month for 3 days they're going to be absent because they're going to be receiving treatment. So we collaborate highly with the student's physician or prescribing doctor. It's required as part of the process that parents provide us with the release so that we can communicate directly with them. And that's so that we can be as responsive as possible in initiating the tutoring. For instances of students with an IEP, we also consider the extent of their services, special education and related services, and we meet with the family to determine, based on their individual circumstance, what is appropriate for the provision of the IEP. There are some students who we can't initiate homebound right away because they're in recovery and they're not medically available yet. And then we do once they are. There are instances where the planning and placement team, and that's the committee who makes decisions for the provision of services for kids who are disabled, can also recommend homebound or hospitalized instruction due to the nature and severity of the disability and how much absence may take place for a student. And then that would be written into the IEP and not a recommendation as per the doctor. So the students in medical situations, which is the vast majority of homebound and hospitalized needs, students who are recommended by the doctor has to fill out a very specific form that pulls directly from the state statute that answers what's the nature of their impairment, why can't they attend school, what are they medically available for. We have, as part of the district, we hire our own homebound tutors who support students, but then also for students in a hospitalization for an extended period of time, most of those facilities have their own tutors who we contract with, and our schools, and at the secondary level, it's a school counselor, and at the elementary level, it's the administrator and the gen ed teacher coordinate with those tutors to make sure that they know what courses they're in and have the content. So it's a lot of facilitation and coordination. And at the secondary level, I will say our school counselors play the lead role there, and they really they do a tremendous amount of work for our students who require this support. Anything else? Most of the time, this instruction, if students are available, does not actually take place in the home. It takes place in some kind of public location, like a public library, somewhere where you can have quiet, but also not necessarily have to go in the home. But we have gone in the home if students not physically or medically well enough to participate in public so long as a parent is present.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions on this policy?
I just had a question regarding, there is a line that states for students who have been excluded from regular school attendance for disciplinary reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could just clarify what that involves.
Right. So students who are involved in a disciplinary process, they still have the right to be educated depending on the duration of whatever the exclusion includes. An exclusion typically includes suspension and in some rare cases expulsion, which actually hits a whole other policy, which is about our obligations to students who the law would say are excluded from school, but we also use our homebound tutors in some cases. There was an update as well a few years ago in terms of the requirements for students who are expelled in terms of providing them more of a holistic program instead of itemized tutoring. And so for many, we don't have many at all, but in the rare cases where we have an expulsion, unless it's most appropriate for the kid, many of those students actually attend another program rather than just having isolated tutoring.
Great questions. Anything else on this policy? Okay, so this policy will also move forward for first read by the full board. I want to thank everybody for their great questions today. Wonderful feedback. And thank you so much. So with that, is there a motion to adjourn? Selena, and a second. Divya, thank you so much.